I think good iconography will have something wakeful about it, usually. It'll have something that doesn't let you just be totally complacent if you come in. I mean, we're people, we're good at being complacent under any circumstances, but there should be some quality of unexpectedness, I think. But that unexpectedness shouldn't be like it's drawing attention to itself, like, here's an unusual icon. That's not the impression you want to get. I feel like I'm doing okay if I hear you say, that's not like I usually see Christ's eyes. That's
Hmm.
more of what I want to hear, is like I'm having some kind of encounter that makes me think.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome today iconographer Seraphim O'Keefe. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Seraphim is not a typical name that I have. I don't know many people who were born with the name Seraphim. Were you born with the name Seraphim, or did you take on the name Seraphim?
Yeah, I got that name when I was baptized about 20 something years ago.
Oh, okay. And where was that?
Well, I was baptized in a monastery in California,
Oh, okay. Which monastery?
called St. Herman's. It's the monastery some people will know where Father Seraphim Rose lived. I spent a good bit of time there when I was a new convert in about 20 years ago.
You lived in Georgia too, right?
Yes, the Georgians sent me to that monastery to
Wait, so
my
you went to Georgia before you became Orthodox?
right. Yes.
So how'd you get to Georgia?
I went when I was 17 in the year 2000 to study painting and drawing from life. There's a man who became my teacher who's from my hometown of Richmond, Virginia, and he lives in Georgia. And my art class in high school went and saw some of his works on exhibition, and he came through and invited anyone who wanted to come for the summer to study painting. I just decided I was going to go, and it all worked out. So
What
I
was his
went,
name?
Jonathan Werdeman. So I went for that summer, and I loved it, and they saw that I was tracking well with what they were teaching, and they invited me. There's two teachers there, Jonathan and a Russian man named Ilya. They invited me back to be an apprentice after I finished high school, so that's what I did.
So you weren't even Orthodox at the time.
Nope.
What were you?
Just completely unchurched.
Oh, okay, interesting. It's always fascinating to hear when someone goes from agnostic or atheist to Orthodox, because it's usually Protestant and then college, and so then it's kind of like nothing, and then
Right.
it's like the
Uh-huh.
whatever they grew up with they felt like was lame, and then they're like, okay, now maybe I'll be like Catholic or something like that, or Anglican, and then from that then they become Orthodox.
Right. Yeah, I would have called myself an atheist. That was kind of what our family called ourselves.
Wow. So what convinced you then? Like, was there like a turning moment when you were, 17, or was it through painting, or how did it happen?
It was going to Georgia and seeing a totally different life than anything I had encountered up to then. I had a happy family growing up, but going over and seeing people who just like lived a really rich spiritual life, they, spent their time pursuing beauty and singing these wild songs and dancing, and they would go to a monastery, and a monk with wild eyes would come out of a cave where monks have been living for over 1,000 years, and I didn't have any defenses against any of that kind of thing when I was a teenager. I just was swept off my feet.
And so then they said, all right, go back to the States and go become baptized in California.
Well, they're not used to converts there at the time because everyone was already Orthodox there, and they have been since the 300s. But so once I started asking questions, they just were like, well, just get baptized. And I wanted to go home first. So this was after high school. I was there for a few months, and I went home. And they said, well, okay, when you're in America, go over to Platina, California, and get baptized.
And you tell them, hey, Virginia and California aren't exactly beside each other. This is like a $multi-thousand endeavor you're sending. Isn't there somewhere closer, on the East Coast?
Yeah. The map of Orthodoxy in America to a Georgian at that time was pretty much just that one spot. And
okay.
So that's where they sent me. And it was good. I loved that place. And I ended up going back a number of times.
Did you ever think you wanted to be a monk?
So, in that period of time after I was baptized, I spent time in a few monasteries, and then I joined a monastery, more or less, that was in the Republic of Georgia, and became a novice there. So, when I was 20, you would have seen me in a black robe building a monastery on the edge of a cliff in kind of like the desert edge of the city in Georgia.
Is that where you fell off of a cliff?
Yeah.
What is that about? What happened?
So I was a novice there, and we were building this monastery, and this day, for whatever reason, my job was to straighten nails. We didn't waste anything, and so we would pull out old nails from old boards and use them to build. So I was pulling out nails and straightening them. But it was January 1st, and very cold. And we were building the roof of a building that actually was going to become the iconography studio. And there's a pile of stones, we were building with stone, that needed to go up to the roof. And I was looking at them longingly because that was a way to get warm. And that was unusual, but nobody was working with me that day, so I decided I'm just going to take some of those stones up to where they need to go for building. And that involved taking the stone and putting it on a lower kind of roof that was there, right on the edge of the cliff. It's a 70-foot kind of sheer cliff that the monastery is built on the top of.
What was the name of the monastery?
St. John the Baptist Desert is what we called it.
So you're moving this stone right on the edge of the cliff, and
right.
Then what happened?
So then you would climb up to that ledge and then put the stone up to the roof and then climb up there and put the stone in the pile of stones where it needs to go. And as I was coming back down from one of those trips, the little stool that I had to sort of clamber up onto the roof slipped, and then I slipped with it as I was coming down, and all the surfaces were icy, so I just went whoop and off the cliff. And So I fell the 70 feet. I had time to think a little bit.
70 feet? My
Yeah.
goodness. Did you break every bone in your body?
And I assumed I would. As I was going down, I thought something along the lines of, I know what this means. You know, we had often looked at that cliff, of course, and thought if you happened to fall off of it, that would be it. So when I landed, I kind of assumed that I'd be dead. And so I was and I think I was knocked a little bit silly, even though I didn't. So, ultimately, I didn't have any injuries, including any head injuries, but I feel like I was somewhat giddy because I was lying there and thinking, well, I guess this is what it's like to be dead. I saw one of my boots up in one of the bushes there, and I was looking to see if my body would be up in a bush, or
Yeah.
if one of
So
my
you thought you were dead?
I thought so. I thought at least that was likely, and then I didn't have anyone to check with, so I ended up having to say, well, I might be dead, but if I'm alive, I might as well try to get back to the monastery. So I knew that if you hike up about a mile that way, the 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 lower side of the cliff kind of rises up, and there's a way to kind of loop around and get back. So I did that, and when I got back, the monk who kind of oversaw day-to-day operations came at me. He was, gonna reprimand me for disappearing, and then the lunch bell rang. So, nobody was going to miss lunch over anything like that. So we ate lunch, and then I was gonna try to sneak back to my cell to. We had a little nap after lunch, but he caught me and he got me to explain myself, and and I don't know why I didn't want anyone to know what happened, but he called the abbot, and the abbot said I needed to stay put in my bed until some doctors came, and they all came and checked me out,
And said you were fine.
yeah, they said I was fine. That was the story.
You didn't break a bone at all. You fell 70 feet. How many stories is that? Is that what, like 6
7
stories
stories.
or something?
I think
7
it's
stories?
Story, yeah.
Oh, okay.
7 stories. Yeah, it's a long fall.
Did you hit anything on the way down? Did something break your fall? Did you roll when you fell down? Did you do some kind of parkour maneuver?
Yeah, I don't have a good explanation. I think it was, they didn't tell me this at the time, but it was treated like kind of a miracle, a blessing on the foundation of this monastery, which is what we were founding it. I mean, I kind of wound up in a bush, but that usually wouldn't help you too much on a fall like that.
Not for 7 stories. Yeah, I guess that's pretty miraculous. I guess God wanted you to do the iconography at St. John of the Ladder.
Yeah, it was just one of those things.
So how long were you a novice?
I was there for about 14 months.
Okay.
How much of that I was a novice is hard to say exactly, but yeah, I was there for about 14 months, and it was a difficult time. Very intense lifestyle, and very little sleep, not very much food, an enormous amount of very physical labor.
Really?
And
How little sleep are we talking? I know I talked to my buddy Elias. He was in St. Ephraim
yeah,
Monastery for like 5 years. And he
right.
was saying, yeah, I mean like 5-6 hours a night, something like that.
Yeah, that might have been on a good day. At our monastery, we were supposed to sleep 6. We probably averaged 4,
Hmm.
because of various factors that, it was not it was not a very well-run monastery at the time. Our abbot was not around much. I was just some kid, and there was not very many people there. But it is where I started painting icons. They said, well, since you're a painter, you should learn to paint icons. So I started to learn just by looking at books, and they had a teacher who would come and give me some instruction, but it was really looking at old icons that was more helpful. I got very sick there, and because there was so little oversight, nobody really was aware of how sick I was getting. And I basically had an enormous health collapse, psychological and physical health. Well, I wouldn't say collapse because I held up the whole time, but
Just exhaustion, or what was it?
Yeah, exhaustion, stress. I was not, definitely not ready for that kind of decision. So I was trying to accept that I had already locked myself into a life where I was going to be speaking Georgian on the edge of a cliff on the other side of the planet from everybody I knew, never have a job or family or anything like that. And that was too much for my 20-year-old self to handle, especially I had, an artistic temperament all growing up, some depression and a lot of anxiety and stuff, and so it all kind of came to a head. That plus just the physical conditions, and there was a monk, Father Alexei. He's the abbot of a Rokor monastery in Australia, who came to teach an iconography course at our monastery. It wasn't for our monastery, but I was allowed to attend it. And he spoke English, and he was an artist, like very much an artist by nature, and I hadn't been around either of those two qualities for about a year by that point. I connected with him, and he saw that I needed some kind of help. I was asking him, would it be a good idea for me to go back and study with my teachers again? And he's saying, no, you're in a monastery, that'll be a temptation for you. And then I kind of said something I was in denial about. I said, I don't know if I can be in a monastery. And he said, well, okay, I can't give you any advice because you have an abbot and so forth, but you need someone to understand where you're at. And that was kind of like the good word that propelled me to I guess stand up for myself. I had to talk to the abbot. I had to tell him, communicate to him. I wrote it down. I actually translated 6 months of my journal for him in order to communicate what was going on with me, which up to then I had kind of this unhealthy view of monasticism, that you're just supposed to pretend that your thoughts don't exist or something, and just deny yourself and so forth. And I didn't know what that meant, of course. And the people in the monastery didn't want me to leave. They thought they told me this is a demon sort of thing, and I had to just say, well, I've got to go. I can't handle this. And
including the abbot didn't want you to leave?
He didn't really want me to leave. He didn't say that this is from the demons. He just said he was trying to give me some alternatives. I mean, he did say these are all bad thoughts and you shouldn't be listening to them, but I did leave, and that, that's not entirely a frowned upon thing. A novice has not taken any vows, and that decision was a huge sort of like rite of passage for me. Just the whole experience was just, I had to really get down into the darkest parts of my inner self while I was there. Really incredibly dark, and then I had to decide, probably for the first time in my life, that that I was going to live. I was going to go forth and looking back now, when I left, I thought I'm gonna probably just go running back to the monastery when I see how bad stuff is out in the world. That didn't happen. The world was full of blessings. The village. I went back to the village and painted with my teachers, and people talked and listened to each other. And the monastery was not a healthy place. A good monastery wouldn't have been like that. But looking back after a lot of work over the last 20 years, I can say, oh, I see what happened there. That was a monastery with no real oversight, and I was a 20-year-old kid sort of using the monastery as a way to punish myself for all the things I was angry about. But I wouldn't go back and change anything from that, because that's how I grew up.
It seems like not every monastery is the same. I mean, Elias was telling me there's, if you go to, what is it, Dionysius on Mount Athos, it's like, yeah, you're going to sleep like 1 hour a night, and it's like constant vigil. But then there's other monasteries you could go to, and you could basically sleep whatever you want, and it's more of an academic monastery where maybe you go get your PhD, and then you come live a monastic life, and then you write theology and stuff for a while, and it's like different types. Whereas like in the West, there's like different orders.
Right.
They have like 30 different types of monk. So you could be a super hermit, or you could just be in the middle of the city and basically be a priest that lives a relatively normal celibate life.
Yeah. We have all that variation. It's not very formalized, so it's sort of like monastery to monastery. How does it all play out? Yeah, there are some real intense ones.
Yeah. But now you're married and you have a bunch of kids, and so
Yeah.
that's how God ordained it.
Yeah.
And so your wife is Ilaria, right? So when did y'all meet?
2006, so after the monastery, I went back and did some more kind of intensive studying with my teachers as an apprentice, and those teachers, by the way, that was not iconography. That was more classical art.
So were you? It was classical art, but were you doing iconography with them, or you were doing classical art and iconography?
No,
or just classical?
Just classical art.
Okay.
Just painting and drawing from life. Then my last year of study was in Moscow, and it was very intense. I was trying to kind of like make up for lost time, and I had a teacher there who I was moving my pencil on the paper, drawing for about 15 hours a day, 5 days a week, and very solitary. I would just see my teacher, and then I'd go to church on Sunday. So I kind of, following that period, I needed some unwinding time, I actually went back to Platina, to the monastery, and the abbot
To
there
the one that you had been at.
to
Okay.
the one where I was baptized in California. And
Oh, that one. Oh, okay.
the abbot said, what you really need is to unwind. And so I went to work on a little organic farm for the growing season. And at the end of that period, so I was living in a tent in the woods working on a farm for about 8 months. And that was when I thought, I guess I was 24, I thought, now I need to go find a wife. And my friends from Georgia, my teacher's wife there is the leader of a really wonderful folk choir. And they did an East Coast tour in the States right about that time. And so I said, I'm going to go on this tour and I'll meet a lot of people there. So I went and I drove one of their tour vans. And right from the start, my teacher said, now I'll introduce you to my goddaughter. And so Ilaria had gone over to Georgia during that time when I was working on the farm, or something like that. And she had been baptized over there, Orthodox, and
In Georgia.
in Georgia. And
So y'all both from Georgia, but you weren't there at the same time.
yep, but in the same village, and my teacher was her godfather, and his wife was her godmother. So they introduced. Well, first he said, "My goddaughter's in this group." There was a big group of young people learning Georgian songs inside the building when I showed up, and so I went in and I tried to pick out which one was going to be his goddaughter just by intuition, and I got it right. So he introduced us, and we just hit it off. She was in college, and she was kind of overwhelmed with the college scene. It was her first year in college, and so she came on the tour for a few days, and she said that she was going to go back to Georgia for her winter break. And that was a point in my life where I had zero plans even for, what I was going to be doing at the end of this tour, a couple of weeks. I just worked on a farm. I was going to go on the tour, and then so I said, well, I'm going to go to Georgia too. And so I said, maybe we could coordinate, and I got tickets on the same plane. And
Nice.
we spent those 3 weeks in Georgia. We got there for New Year's Day. And it was just magical. So
There you go. But she's not Georgian, right? She's also American.
yep. She's from New England, from Vermont.
Okay, just independently fell in love with Georgia as well.
She went there. There's a group from Vermont that goes to different countries to learn their folk music traditions. So she went with that group.
Okay, wow. And so how long after that till y'all got married?
Couple years. She wanted to finish college, and I needed to make some kind of plan of how to make money. I had zero plan at that point. Well, I was gonna paint. I would paint landscapes at the river, and I could sell paintings, okay, in the same galleries with my teachers. That's what I was doing, and I loved that lifestyle. I would just go to the river and be there all day. But then, about 2008, when the economy crashed, all the galleries stopped selling paintings, mostly. And
Okay.
so that became clear that wasn't really going to be a way to make money. And so I tried some things. I tried comics, and that kind of went up and then back down over the course of a year or so as a
Did you
possibility.
make money with it?
I was so I had I have a good friend, Dash Shaw, who helped me get into the scene. I had a sponsor, like I had a patron who was buying my originals for a good price. So I was doing well, and it looked like it was going to go up and up, and then a few things changed, and it all came crashing back down.
Oh
The,
no, what happened?
well, my patron just kind of disappeared, and then the publication that I was publishing in stopped. That publication ended, and there wasn't really a good one to move over to. And I was getting, I was needing some kind of a plan, but that didn't work. And then Ilaria and I spent the summer in Alaska with a community that saw that I could draw and paint, and they started having me paint some icons for them. I painted one for their tour bus. On the back of their tour bus, they had a musical ensemble, or they would tour around the country singing and dancing. And I painted something for their big meal hall, and one for their iconostas in their little chapel. And I was using oil paints and house paints and all kinds of things. And but it was really exciting to be working on art for a community like that. I hadn't experienced that before, where they saw that I could draw and paint, and they had something they wanted me to draw and paint that was part of their life. Like, here's who we are, and here's like how we live our life. Can you do the painting part of that? And it's like so I would like do a sketch and say, well, maybe you're thinking of something like this, and they'd be like, something like that, but a little more like this. It's like the vision and the energy was coming from a community. And usually for artists, especially nowadays, for visual artists, vision and energy comes from the artist. It's sort of like you're a spectacle that people are supposed to come and sort of passively consume, and
This was a little more incarnational.
yeah, and participatory. It's like this is part of their life. I don't have to convince them that they want this, which is kind of how the gallery scene works. It's like, you might want this because, it's a good investment or whatever.
And you mostly did sort of, even in that type of art, it was more like traditional landscapes and stuff like that. Did you ever do the super modern stuff?
I guess you could call a lot of what I did as a teenager super modern, or just very experimental. And I don't know where I would have eventually gone if I stayed in that world, but I was happy to actually get out of that world. After that summer, I just decided I'm gonna try to do iconography, and then doors started opening up, and there was a blessing for that.
Great. And you're the full-time iconographer now at St. John of the Ladder, right?
Yep.
It seems pretty wild. Not a lot of people, know of full-time iconographer at a church.
Right. Well, I do various projects. That's not the only one I'm working on right now. But
Okay.
so I'm like the half-time iconographer at St. John of the Ladder, but I am the resident iconographer, and that's my big project, right? It's probably 11 or 12 year half-time project, but I go around doing other things as well.
Okay.
Other iconography things. So yeah, I've been doing
Right.
iconography full time since that time.
Well, how many years is that?
Something like 15.
15 years? Wow. And how different is the iconography from, the landscape painting and that type of stuff?
Well, it's very different in the way I described, in terms of the actual culture surrounding it and the way the kind of lifestyle.
But more like technique-wise,
Technique-wise, I painted landscapes in oils mostly, so I don't do that anymore.
Forgive my dumb questions, but I know that a lot of icons are on egg tempera, right?
Right. Yeah.
Could you do an icon with oil painting, or not so much?
Yeah, you can. I have, and Saint Sophrony of Essex painted icons in oils in the monastery in Essex, England, in recent times. Yeah, there's a lot of iconographers who have done oils. There's no real rule about that. Egg tempera is really good for the kinds of qualities that iconographers usually look for.
Like so what?
Well, and that's specifically for panel icon painting as opposed to murals on the walls. Egg tempera has a depth to it. The sort of gradual building up of the layers works well. Oil paint, sometimes you'll hear iconographers say oil paint is too sensual. I kind of lean towards away towards any kind of real formulaic. I think you can paint with oils in an appropriate way for iconography, but I don't know. Egg tempera, I mean, part of it is that's the paint that's been used for the great majority of icons that we have passed down to us, and so it's good at getting qualities that are similar to those qualities.
Okay.
But yeah, something about the layer. There is something kind of contemplative about the kind of deep layered effects of egg that you can get with egg tempera. So,
what else about the the landscape painting and that sort of oil painting and iconography? What carries over and what doesn't carry over? What do you have to leave behind?
I mean, as an iconographer, I'm probably on the side of things that I'm less. You'll get some schools of iconography that are very kind of like formulaic or very kind of like standardized in the way they do things, and you'll get schools that are more free with that kind of thing. I don't know, the words I'm choosing, you can tell that I like that I think along the lines of the freer side of things. So for me, like when I would go out and paint from nature, the way my teachers taught me, it was always kind of learning how to see, how to use my eyes, how to take everything in as a whole, and how to express everything as a whole. And in a lot of ways, I feel like I'm still doing that when I paint icons. It's not in an obvious way. Obviously, I'm not painting a scene that's right before my eyes, per se, but it I think it can still apply, that there's a sense of gazing at the subject and finding the abstract elements that are going to bring that to life on my wall or my panel. I mostly do walls, but
do you do a lot of, I mean, you just said you mostly do walls, but do you do some iconostasis or
Yep, there's one.
Personal icons.
You can see behind.
Yeah.
I do some of that. I'm sure I'll do more over time.
So what's different about the walls then? Is that a totally different technique than painting an iconostasis?
Yeah, I mean, so generally we don't use egg tempera for walls, although it's some people might do that. But usually you'll see just generally through the tradition, wall painting is done more freely. There's less of an emphasis on kind of this layered, deep surface quality and more of an emphasis on kind of like more fresh, more spontaneous, maybe looser even. So you'll see when you have examples of iconographers who do both, you'll see that those kinds of differences between their panel icons and their wall paintings. And you know, the generally panel icon tends to be more geared towards a close encounter where you're close to the image. That's why that kind of layered and rich, deep surface works for it. It's like more of a contemplative encounter. The walls are they're surrounding you in a church, and they are made to kind of interact with the movements of people in the church and the songs and readings and the incense and the whole activity of liturgy. They're they participate in that kind of big.
Right. So what does that mean in how it's painted? I mean, what's the difference, like visually, between something that's supposed to be more intimate in your face and something that's more dynamic and
Right.
musical? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, those are the qualities I was mentioning. That and besides, what I have been saying, the wall paintings will kind of play in the architecture in a way that facilitates that. So, like, generally, things that are on the side walls will often have a more narrative quality, um, where there's movement and maybe movement from one image to the next or movement within the image. But there'll usually be some kind of sequence, we call programming, some kind of way that all the images work together. But then things that are in the front and center, or especially up on the ceiling, if there's a dome or something, will be more hieratic. They'll be more like static. They'll be more kind of centering, symmetrical.
Okay.
And
Is that kind of universally followed, or this is more your paradigm?
No, that's pretty general all through the history of. It's fairly intuitive way for things to be. It has a lot to do with how the building is used,
So, like at St. John of the Ladder, like, what formula do you have to follow? So, like, I know, right, like Christ has to be Pantocrator in the dome, right? Is there any exception to that? Could you do something else, or?
Yeah, that's right. The more central parts are more static in the tradition. So, yeah, Christ in the dome is pretty much, that's what you're gonna do if you have a dome.
And the apse is generally like what, Mary with Christ in her womb?
Yeah, I mean, so.
Or like on her lap?
Yeah, generally, like it depends if there's a dome. If there's not a dome, then you have Christ in the apse, and and usually Mary would be below him in the apse. It comes out of the apse it depicts the ascension traditionally. Like in ancient times, you would have some form of an ascension, Christ enthroned in the heavens. Like that's kind of the central image of the church, with the Mary and the apostles standing there. And then when you get domes in churches, the Christ moves up to the dome, and that dome represents, the throne and the heavens, and then Mary is in the top of the apse, just like she would be kind of central in the Ascension image. And that so that is pretty much the core of of the way we would decorate a church. Now there is variation. I mean, if you have a dome, you'll have Christ there. There's various ways for that to be, and then some churches have a bunch of domes, and then that's a whole other question. But the central dome will have Christ.
And the back wall, doesn't that, there's in there a few options for the back wall? It could be the Dormition, or it could be the Last Judgment, or it could be Pentecost. Is that right?
Yeah. And
I've seen it Pentecost one place. I think I was in Karlovy in the Czech Republic, and it was Pentecost at the back, and I thought, I've never actually seen one. I knew it was technically possible, but. And actually, I was with a buddy whose name is Christopher, and he's I keep trying to convince him to become a monk, which is, for an agnostic, that's a big jump, And so I don't know if he's agnostic, but he's something anyway. And then, Jonathan goes on this whole thing about Saint Christopher, and then this one Christopher icon of the Pentecost with the dog-headed man in there instead of Cosmos. Right. And so I looked back, and he was just looking up, and he was right in the doorway, and I snapped a picture. I'm like, it's Christopher and the icon of Pentecost. He didn't get it. He had no idea what I was talking about.
Yeah.
But
I like putting Pentecost there. And then older churches won't even have usually those three. Basically, when you get out from the more central images, you have more and more variation. So even the Theotokos, there might be a good bit of variation of how that's done in the apse. And then below her, even more. And then when you get to the side walls, you'll have a lot of variation. And I think generally in the oldest churches, you would basically have a festal cycle. That's true of old and new churches. Some kind of cycle that represents the church calendar and the kind of festal rhythm of the year, starting with the Annunciation on the east and moving left to right, kind of in a circle or spiral form. If you have multiple cycles, it'll spiral. Usually time will move from up to down, so you would have maybe Genesis at the top and go down through Old, New Testament, get to saints down at the level where people stand, and then the next spiral down is the people actually standing in the church. That's kind of how it's conceived. But then so I think the oldest churches, the back wall would just be whatever kind of falls into that cycle. And a lot of times you would get maybe the crucifixion, some passion images on the back wall. But there's more variation as you go out. And when you get to the narthex, there's quite a lot of variation, for example. And then I think really, as far as like creativity goes, you think of that as a language rather than as a formula, you know.
Okay.
And that's like the way we make meaning, you know. Like just like language, it has to have grammar. There has to be some kinds of consistent qualities of it so that we can make meaning, right? And then designing a church program is more like speaking that language, you know.
And what did you put in the narthex at St. John of the Ladder? I forget.
Well, the theme in our narthex is baptism, which is like more or less a common theme in the narthex where baptism takes place traditionally. So we have the baptism of Christ on the east wall of the narthex, so that's what you see when you come in. So actually you'll see St. John the Baptist baptizing Christ in the Jordan right above the doors to the nave. So like as you enter the nave, you're kind of walking through that event. the north and south walls, so that's the sides, have the Exodus from Egypt, Moses leading the Israelites through, and Elijah crossing the Jordan and going up in the fiery chariot.
And this is just in the narthex we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. So there's one scene per. It's a square room, one scene per wall. So you've got the baptism of Christ, to the Exodus, and Elijah, and then the back wall is the Transfiguration, which is it's related to the baptism in a sense. There's a lot of echoes between them. These are the two scenes where the voice of God says, "This is my beloved Son," but also when we do baptisms, the newly baptized put on a white robe, and it's called the traditional name for baptism is enlightenment or illumination. So the Transfiguration is there to bring that out, as well as just to be the final image you see as you go back out into the world. We sing at the end of liturgy after communion. The song we sing is, "We have seen the true light, we have received the heavenly Spirit," and this image is there to sort of say, you've been in here, and when you go back out, you should be seeing the world in a new light.
Yeah, I never thought about the connection between Transfiguration and baptism. Isn't Transfiguration one of those super important icons for iconographers? Like it's like the first icon you make or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's maybe a Russian tradition, because it's connected with an idea that the light depicted in icons is the light of the Transfiguration.
Hey, hit that like button! So do you speak Russian as well? You speak Georgian, but...
I speak Georgian a little, and I'm forgetting it over time. I spoke Russian well enough to bang out a conversation with my teacher, who only spoke Russian, but it also involved a lot of gesticulation, and I didn't learn the grammar, and it's hard grammar.
Even more complicated than German. In German, it's hard enough. Yeah. It's was it 6 tenses or something in German, but there's 20 in Russian or something stupid like that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even know how many tenses there'd be, but I know that it's difficult.
Now, can't you put the pagan philosophers on the narthex as well? Aren't there some churches that they'll put Plato and Aristotle without a halo in the narthex?
You'll see some of that in Greece, where they say that it's people who prepared the world to hear the gospel. Yeah, that's possible.
So what's your plan for St. John of the Ladder? What's your overall mapping? Because you've gotten, how far are you now? You're halfway through?
Halfway. Well, so what we're doing is kind of zooming in on one portion of the traditional program, and that's kind of the pairing of nativity and resurrection. It's something that our church calendar does, or the services of those two seasons, is that really with the resurrection as the standard, then the services of the nativity reflect the same kind of pattern of Christmas. So that is to say, the way that the services flow during the weeks kind of leading up to each feast, and in some way even the texts of the hymnography for each feast reflect each other, and the iconography traditionally has reflected. So you'll have the resurrection, the main image is the harrowing of hell, where Christ is down in a cavern under the earth, and then the image of the nativity, Christ's birth takes place in a cave, and he's dressed in grave clothes, and the manger is depicted kind of as a grave. There's a lot of very rich kind of relation between Christmas and the resurrection. And when I come into a church to design what iconography is going to be like, usually I talk to the priest, and that's my main contact, and like together we kind of try to recognize what iconography, you could almost say, is waiting to be realized in this community. Like what is this church building and this community and kind of like the life of the community liturgically, what is it saying, what's there already. And that theme of nativity and resurrection was really the core of what came out of that kind of listening that we did.
So what does that mean as far as, does that mean like the side walls, one will be nativity and one will be resurrection? Or?
Right, so there's two large side walls in the transepts, about 20 by 20 feet, and that'll be the nativity and the resurrection directly opposite each other across the space. And so from that kind of core, we have a passion resurrection sequence going from the back to the front of the church, on the south side. That'll include the resurrection.
Okay.
And then a nativity sequence going the north side. That'll include the nativity itself.
And you haven't done those yet, right? Like those are upcoming?
The big walls are upcoming. Actually, the nativity is the next one I'll get started on in a few months here.
And you finished the dome and the transept, right? Not the transept, the dome and the apse.
The dome, yep. The dome and the apse are finished, as well as the narthex and two little, the sacristy and the side chapel. So.
And there's some pretty wild ones in there, yeah. And then like Elijah going up.
Well, that's in the narthex, yeah. And the side chapel, which is kind of the sacristy to the south of the altar, is dedicated to Moses and the burning bush, and so there's the theme in there is fire. And so yeah, you have the burning bush, you have the three youths in the furnace from the book of Daniel, you have Elijah receiving the burning coal from an angel, and then Pentecost is on the back wall of that chapel.
Nice. Yeah, I like those. Those are a little wild looking compared to some other iconography I've seen. Let me ask, so, it's like Andrew Gould designed the building. He tried to do the whole architectural design around timber framing and tons of wood. And so how does his architecture, how does that determine maybe your color scheme or what kind of, how you go about, doing the iconography for the whole church compared to some other church which is entirely plaster?
Yeah. I mean, you take things on a church by church basis, but yeah, having all the wood makes for a very warm space. It's very golden and rich. So, and the wood covers the walls up to about 9 feet. I'm leaning towards cooler colors to kind of balance that. I think part of Andrew's design was to use the local wood in a way similar to how in some old Byzantine churches they would use marble to clad the walls. And so so those would have been cool colors. So it's a similar concept, but very warm colors rather than cool colors. So my palette is affected. I wanted, if I was using real warm colors and like very yellow tones, like a lot of times you'll see the church would just feel kind of overly warm. So I want to make it so that it feels like there's room for a cool breeze in the higher registers of the church.
So is that why there's like a greenish, it's a little more green and not gray, but a little grayer and a little greener?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of I'll be using a lot of green. You'll see it more and more, but the apse has a lot of green. And another thing I'm doing, because of Andrew also included more windows than you'd find in old Byzantine churches, which I love, but it also creates a lot of challenges. A lot of the spaces are U-shaped because there's a double window in the center of any given space. And so that's a challenge, and it has borne some good fruit. I think that, like in the dome, it forced me to find kind of a more diagonal, dynamic posture for the prophets that are on the walls of the dome, the tower. So
Yeah, they look like they're running.
yeah, a little bit like that. I had to use the space in a more of a diagonal way to make that work, and that led into just kind of having a little bit more dynamic all through the dome than you would see sometimes. So there's kind of like a little bit of a spiral upwards in the movement of the figures in the dome, including the angels that are around Christ. And so I'm kind of keep playing into that with what's below. It also, the way the windows are, kind of makes it hard to divide the space with lines, which probably in most churches you'll see the different scenes are divided with borders. Sometimes it's decorational borders,
Okay.
and so that was impossible in the dome because of it's octagonal and it has double windows on each face. If I had used dividing lines, there would be no space for the figures. So, and it's also difficult in a lot of the other parts of the church. So I've decided to take that and sort of challenge myself to not use any borders to divide the space. And so I'm just using the architecture to divide the space, whether it's a corner or whether it's a double window, and to those things will punctuate the different scenes that show up, and then there'll be kind of a continuous landscape throughout.
Interesting.
And that's a combination of the conditions of the church that Andrew designed and my own vision for how I do. I kind of lean towards that type of design anyway.
And is your style of painting, is it particularly like Georgian influenced, or some other?
Well, I don't think you would see too much Georgian. I didn't learn that much about iconography in Georgia.
More in Russia?
Really, it wasn't till I was back home. I
Okay.
certainly learned a lot by living with it over there in those two countries, but I didn't study those. I didn't study it there. Really, I just kind of have drawn on my background as an artist and brought my work to iconographers who I respect to get feedback from. I still do that. And other than that, I just study from the great icons of past times. And I think that's a pretty common way for people in the English-speaking world to have learned, and even in Orthodox countries, because a lot of the education was cut off by like the Soviet government and stuff like that. So
Yeah, how did that affect like the iconography there? So I mean, like I know it was horrible for the chant tradition. It basically almost eradicated the chant tradition if it wasn't for like 5 guys.
yeah, it's very complex how it all happened. I mean, a great deal of iconography was destroyed in a lot of churches. On the other hand, that all took place during a time when iconography was getting lost anyway. There was kind of like the way that people were painting icons up to that time tended to be like faux Renaissance. It's not all, I wouldn't say it's all bad, but it's like there was a lack of appreciation of the older iconography. It was considered primitive. So that time kind of coincided with a lot of cultured people wound up in Europe from Russia and from Soviet countries. They encountered like the modern art movement. This was around 20s, 30s, and so on, when you had a lot of the big names in modern art working in places like Paris. And these people were looking back to ancient art and curious about that power that ancient art had, and people like Picasso and Matisse, and saying, how do we get that power from that they had in ancient art? And a lot of those artists at that time, that kind of helped also the revival of traditional iconography. So a lot of the a lot of the people who were in Europe, especially in Paris, were drawn to look back at the ancient models and to say, these are not primitive, they're in fact more, they're deeper and more kind of not sophisticated, but more meaningful than, the attempts of the last couple centuries to make sophisticated iconography. So
what's your opinion then of the 18th, 19th century classical style in Russia, where it's trying to look like, Western paintings? I mean, do you just totally hate all of that stuff, or
no, I don't.
It's not your cup of tea, or what's your opinion?
No, I mean, I'm glad that we're moving away from that, but some of it's nice, some of it is very kind of smarmy. There's a lot of variations on it, but
it's a funny thing because it's granted, I'm not Orthodox, but I would hate to see a Christian world where you couldn't have Michelangelo, no matter what Jonathan might say about Michelangelo. It's there is something beautiful about a Caravaggio painting of something from the Gospels, and so for me it's
yeah.
it's I don't want to lose any of that, but there's also something about the beauty of a tradition and upholding that tradition. It could be the same in music. It's you could write extremely complicated stuff that you need a professional choir for, or incorporating other instruments, but then at some point you lose the tradition. So it seems like there's a struggle there between balancing preservation and taming progress and how to incorporate it. So
Yeah.
I don't know, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, now I don't think that as an Orthodox person there'd be any reason to get rid of Caravaggio, but Caravaggio didn't paint icons, he didn't paint art to be used in church. At least I don't know of any. He painted oil paintings, that were to be viewed as art, whatever that means.
So then what about an altar piece by El Greco, like an El Greco
Yeah.
altar piece?
Yeah. What I'd say is there's no rule. There's not a rule that says you can do this and you can't do that, especially as far as style goes. And I think that the kind of dominant tradition of iconography over time is the way it is. It has a great deal of variation, but the kinds of forms that people were exploring in the Renaissance with single point perspective and a lot of what we call illusionistic art, artwork that's really trying to make it look like there's a form, a three-dimensional form there that you're seeing from a certain angle. Generally, it doesn't work well for the liturgical context.
Okay.
Because, and I think that's the intuition that church planners have had and iconographers throughout time, is that this isn't made to be stared at. It's not. If you put on your wall something from a single point perspective, then it's properly viewed while facing it directly, So if it's on the side wall and it has a vanishing point out that way, you would look at it while you're turned towards it, and it's sort of it would draw away from the kind of unity of the overall sort of what's going on in the church, to have individual points of focus that kind of called for individual eyes to look in their direction. And I think, yeah, I think just like three-dimensional form, where you're trying to depict bodies, let's say, that look like they're actually actually there in a three-dimensional way. My intuition is that just doesn't work in a liturgical context very well. It's like you don't want them to be drawing that kind of attention. But
Have you seen the chapel in, I think it's the Vizarod Castle in Prague? Outside of it, your entire thing is frescoed, and there's a lot of ornamentation, and it's super colorful, like ridiculously colorful, and it's all Art Nouveau. Have you ever seen that place before?
No, I haven't. That's cool.
It's like all Art Nouveau iconography. And to me, I wonder if it kind of matches what you're talking about, because it seems like part of what you're saying is that like the single point perspective in Western art draws your attention to the thing. Well, and liturgically, if your attention is supposed to be drawn to God, right, then the iconography on the walls has more of a feeling of, it's like in the periphery, there's the saints.
Yeah.
You know, and if you turn and look to it, it's there. It's like you're surrounded by all of the saints. And I felt the same way there. But part of the Art Nouveau is like the faces are clear, but the bodies, you know, have like an outline, and they're kind of fuzzy with that kind of Art Nouveau style iconography. And I thought, man, this would be awesome if, you know, like if there was ever a legitimate, I keep saying that, but not to say that the Western Rite that exists isn't legitimate, but, you know, I mean, more legitimate, you know, like more than like 5 of them in existence in the United States, you know, like if it was actually a big thing, I was like, man, this would be the place that could serve as sort of a paragon for like Western iconography.
Yeah.
Because it's super Western, but I don't know, there was something about it that had the pathos of...
Yeah, I think that's right.
I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think I think I have seen this before. Yeah, I think there's a lot there to draw from, and you wouldn't even have to do it in a Western Rite church per se. Like, I mean, I definitely take some influence from Art Nouveau and some of my work, Art Nouveau and really the Romanesque iconography that in some ways anticipates Art Nouveau.
Yeah, how so? What about your work is influenced by it?
Well, I mean, my work is just influenced by everything that I see. It's influenced by, but I love a lot of those artists and a lot of that imagery. Working at St. John of the Ladder, I've been looking at a lot more Romanesque iconography, which like Art Nouveau has a lot more kind of like stylized, flowing lines. So I think Andrew...
Is that similar to what like Aidan Hart does, or is that totally different? Because I won't lie, when I see Aidan Hart stuff, I mean, it's awesome, but there's something weird about the faces, where like the eyes are super big, or like one eye is bigger than the other eye. And I know he's doing something there. I don't know what he's doing. But is that Romanesque iconography, or that's like, or is that more Anglo-Saxon, and is that different?
Well, I mean, Aidan, you can see he's done a lot of things over the years, and he draws from everything as well, as far as I can see. Definitely from some Romanesque iconography, but probably some of the asymmetry in the eyes is something people have noticed in iconography all through time. It's not the only way it's done, but you know, if you think of the famous Christ from Mount Sinai, it has these 2 very different eyes, and that's something that has drawn a lot of attention of iconographers.
So it's not particularly Anglo-Saxon. It's also a universal thing.
That kind of asymmetry, yeah, that it's one of the tools in the toolbox, I'd say. I find sometimes an asymmetry in the face can be effective. It just depends on the context, you know. I think Aidan, his mission statement is to depict the spiritual person by depicting their body. And so sometimes I think those kinds of qualities that kind of get your eye to transcend the image as an illusion, or like if you send a message to the eyes that says, this is not just like a straightforward, snapshot of a person. You're supposed to move past the surface of this image. I think that can be one of the ways to give that message to the eyes, something like that.
Okay, so it's something that like breaks you out of frame or out of your normal perception. And so, who were the iconographers that you were talking about who went to Paris and studied with all the modernists? Did they incorporate that into their iconography? Like, who are those iconographers you're referencing?
Okay, well, the main two that are the obvious examples: Leonid Uspensky and Father Gregory Krug. And I've become something of a, I don't know, scholar. Devotee, sure, yeah.
Of Gregory Krug?
Of the two of them.
Okay. Tell me more.
They were from Russia. Uspensky, he was a revolutionary. He got lined up in front of a firing squad of the White Army and pardoned at the last second. And he had a moment. It was kind of similar to Dostoevsky's biography, but he had a moment where right then, when looked at the grass and the color of it, he thought, he said something like, "I didn't think the universe could contain that much beauty," and he wanted to be an artist. He wound up exiled in Paris, as did Father Gregory Krug as a younger man. So Krug was a Christian. He was Orthodox by the time he got to Paris. He grew up a Lutheran, actually, but he converted in his teenage years. He was a very well-trained artist as a young man, and they were amongst the refugees in Paris from the Soviet times who were kind of unwelcome in Paris. These Russians, a fascinating community to study, because they tended to be very much like intellectuals and cultured people, aristocrats, who had to walk away from everything and stick together so that they could survive in pretty dire poverty in Paris. And some other places in Europe had groups like this, but Paris was maybe the most important. So a lot of our important theologians of the last century came out of that.
Wasn't that Schmemann? Wasn't he in Paris for a while? And
he was part of that.
Florensky, was he?
Yeah, he was connected, with those people, and Florovsky and Losky and Bulgakov and a lot of the real important theologians, and just writers and poets and musicians and historians. You had all. So these two iconographers, so the two of them, they went to an art school that was founded by Leo Tolstoy's granddaughter, and they had some pretty good teachers. They were teaching these Russian people who wanted to learn at a pretty high level, and they got introduced to the avant-garde. Especially Krug was working in the studio of a couple of the avant-garde artists. I can't remember the names, but suffice it to say that they were high-level artists who gradually moved towards iconography and towards really taking their faith seriously. They were in groups with some of these theologians and thinkers, and they looked around at. This was one of the early times when Orthodox people were in a country surrounded by Western Christians. So they were asking a lot of questions like, what does this mean? Like, what is our attitude? if we make iconography in this context, what should it look like? And so they would present their work to this group and get guidance and feedback, and they ended up making some of the most beautiful. Father Gregory became a monk. He just lived in dire poverty in a monastery, painting all the time, and his work is particularly striking. It's very, like, both of them are very devoted to the tradition, and really you can say they revived the kind of older tradition, which was really getting lost at that time. They studied, there was a Byzantine library there, a lot of antique Russian icons were passing through the Paris marketplaces, that they would study them carefully. And Father Gregory, but they also, I think they lived by this principle that they're men of their time, and that they brought who they are to the task, offered everything that they had to the task, which included all of their influences.
Yeah, I'm looking at it, and there's pardon if this sounds ridiculous, but there's almost a little bit of like Gauguin.
Yeah,
kind of.
Yeah, some of the kind of abstraction that you'll see in some of the modern artists, you'll see a similar tendency. Yeah, Gauguin, or probably any of the artists influenced by Cézanne, which is, that whole generation. But I think, like, carefully studying his work, he's more leaning into things that are present in the tradition, but coming from the same context as those artists. Like, so I'd have a hard time saying what artist their work looks like. So Father Gregory's is much more kind of, it has more of a wildness to it, despite what you might see on photographs of his work. The colors are more alive than just about any other painting I've seen. I went over and studied his work in person for a while, and it's like you can hardly believe that those colors are there. And Ouspensky's work is more workmanlike. It's more kind of like, it has kind of like a disciplined but very deep quality to it.
Is there an analog with, maybe another artist with regards to the colors? I mean, maybe it's the cliche thing to say, but, you see pictures of Van Gogh, but then when you see it in person, it's like, whoa, that is super striking, much more than seeing a photo of it.
Yeah. I mean, any great colorist is going to be that way. Photos don't carry that kind of color. But I think really what I love in their work, and I think anybody who knows their work can see that I have a lot of influence from them, probably too much sometimes, is that they have this complete, I would say, allergy to formalism. Like, they won't let the formal qualities of their work get in the way of the kind of like encounter, the kind of like transcendent encounter of the work. Like, a lot of iconographers now can do some real fancy brush work, can make some real impressive imagery, and that's okay. All those things are good tools in the toolbox. But Ouspensky and Krug just would not let those kinds of qualities draw the attention away from the encounter. So that their work does have very beautiful formal qualities, but it's all in service of something besides the formal qualities.
So speaking of color, what do you like about Gregory Krug's color?
I don't know. I mean, in some way, that's a whole world of color in my little universe that you're asking about. But
well, take me into the universe. We can go down the palette: green, red, orange.
It's always unexpected. the color. It's never asleep. That is, it's never formulaic, and it always seems like it's born of some kind of encounter. That's true of Uspensky in another way. The two of them are good friends and work together, but Uspensky is the one who we have more stories about. Father Gregory was very reclusive, but I was
Had quite the mustache from the pictures.
Yes.
It's like, I know it's like a monastic thing, you don't. But it's like, God, it's gotta be hard to eat if your mustache is like down to here.
And he's particularly funny looking because he couldn't grow a beard at all, just the mustache. But Uspensky, some of Uspensky's students are still alive. Father Gregory didn't teach. Some of Uspensky's students are alive and well. He died in 1987. And one of his students is a monk in California, Father Patrick Doolin, who I was asking him about this question because I said, I see a lot of iconographers out there with all kinds of colors and so forth, but I look at this one icon, let's say, and I was describing this one, and it just has it's a St. Gregory Palamas. He said, I just look at those colors and how they combine with the colors in the icon, and they're just astonishing. I can hardly believe that he found that pair of colors and put them next to each other. He said that Uspensky worked on painting icons something like 12 hours a day usually, and just in his little apartment. He and his wife lived in Paris, and they went to church, and so on a Sunday his wife accepted an invitation to go to lunch, go at somebody's house, one of their friends. Uspensky said okay. He said, every time I think I'm going to get a chance to paint. And and so Father Patrick...
He didn't want to go to lunch, I take it.
Well, not as much as he wanted to paint. And Father Patrick just reflected. It's what was it that made him look forward to it so much? He just wanted to go to his table in his apartment, even though he had been doing it all week, probably 12 hours a day. And he said he would watch something unfold on his icon. Watch what happened maybe if you put a line here, this kind of a line, or this color next to that color. And there would be a kind of excitement or a kind of joy of encounter when something showed up on his board. And I think that story is kind of the best I can do at saying what it is. What is it about those colors? There's no formula to find colors like that, but it has to just be that quality of attention.
And what about the colorists, later in the 20th century, or Rothko and stuff like that? Is that influential on you at all, or is that just a bunch of nonsense, or the stuff Kandinsky said about color?
Well, I think the stuff he said might be not exactly the stuff he did. I'll look at anything, and I don't have as much of a background in that field of art, but I look at it and I learn things from them, and sometimes they find something beautiful that I value a lot. I definitely will look at colorists like Paul Cézanne is probably the one I'm looking at the most right now, and I learn a lot about color from those guys. I was looking at Paul Klee, who's more he was a contemporary of Kandinsky.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'll look at anything and learn.
So, what do you learn from Cézanne about color or Klee?
You can't really talk about color too good with words, I just look at that painting and look at the way those colors work together. And then what am I gonna say? But it's when I paint the time. That's how I'm supporting my family. I get up there with my colors and paint and paint. And doing that is a lot of output. It's a lot. It's a lot to produce. It's a lot of color decisions every day. Thousands of them. And probably the way I paint is particularly that way because especially when I'm completing work, I have a palette. I'm mixing colors on my palette, and all that output just produces a necessity for some kind of sustenance, some kind of food. And so I'm looking at artists. I'm looking at everything. Trying to drink in, getting some input, some like after a week of color decisions, looking at a Cezanne painting is like eating at a banquet when I've been, hungry all
Yeah.
week. It's just like there's a lot there. There's a lot of connections to be made just by like seeing. I mean, I think he's just one of the greatest colorists, and I wouldn't be so eager to just look at any old thing, but any old thing also I do look at any old thing, and it all goes into the work.
So let me ask a few last questions specifically about stuff like I've seen of yours, like at St. John of the Ladder. So like the Pantocrator, the eyes are super darker than any eyes of Christ I've ever seen. Was that yes, I guess why?
The pupils
But
are wider than what you usually see probably by a good bit. It was something that seemed to be calling out to be done. I mean, part of it was, when you have eyes with wide pupils, that denotes a close encounter, right? Your pupils widen when you get closer to a person, and so I think I lean towards the wider pupils in general in my work, probably getting a lot of that from Father Gregory Krug and from some of the painters that he was influenced by, like Theophan the Greek is really one of my great heroes. Theophan the Greek's Pantocrator that we still have has a that was the real kind of like the spiritual predecessor for the one that I painted at St. John of the Ladder. There's something about it. It's not in the best repair, but it has this kind of wide-eyed gaze and a real kind of like this slight kind of poise to it that makes him look like that he's alive, that he's awake. I don't know.
Yeah, it looks almost like what you would think they would do the Father as in the West.
Maybe so.
Yeah, I don't know. It just looks kind of older.
Yeah.
Is this the Salvator Mundi, Savior of the World, 1378 by Theophanes the Greek Pantocrator?
Yeah, that'd be it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, part of that might be there's some damage, I think, around the mouth. With that in mind, and looking at other images, but that one, there was something in that I felt like I needed to look for as I was working on that.
I like the eyes. I just haven't seen eyes like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do think it's important to me. There's a balance, I think, I think it's possible and common in iconography for the images to be kind of sleepy, like it's sort of like you come in, this is what iconography looks like, oh yeah, there's this, there's that, it's done this way, and it checks all the boxes or something, and there's kind of like I think good iconography will have something wakeful about it. Usually it'll have something that doesn't let you just be totally complacent if you come in. I mean, we're people, we're good at being complacent under any circumstances, but there should be some quality of unexpectedness, I think. But that unexpectedness shouldn't be like it's drawing attention to itself, like, here's an
Yeah.
unusual icon. That's not the impression you want to get. I feel like
I
I'm
will say,
doing
yeah.
okay if I hear you say, that's not like I usually see Christ's eyes. That's
Hmm.
more of what I want to hear, is like I'm having some kind of encounter that makes me think, makes me.
I love the red, like the red of his shirt, and then it sort of, and it seems like the blues as I'm looking at it. I mean, do you have what, four different shades of blue in that Pantocrator? Because there's like the blue of his coat, and then there's like a lighter blue on the insides of the angel wings,
Yeah.
and then there's like a nut, and then there's like an even lighter blue on like the skirt around some of the angel's wings.
Hmm.
But then it looks like the seraphim might even be a different shade of blue, or that might be the same. It's kind of hard to tell in the picture.
Yeah, I
But
think probably all those feathers have different blues, and yeah, I value that a lot. Like I'm definitely always looking for the colors to do something that's like,
yeah, is each seraphim a different shade of blue?
yeah, they're all, yeah, really any color that you see up there will be different from any other, and that's part of
Okay.
this. That's kind of that has something to do with how I work. I don't tend to use standard colors. Like I won't mix up a big batch of a color and use it everywhere. I kind of mix each one to purpose, uh, and small
Wow.
amounts, and I adjust them, and I look for them to, I don't know, to kind of activate each other in a way.
No, it's great because if you looked at it, it is subtle. Like I wouldn't necessarily notice without looking at it for a minute that like the blue and the feathers is different in each of the
Yeah.
seraphim. But then if you look at it, you're like, oh wow, no, one of them is pretty robust blue, and another one is like really greenish blue, you know. And so that's awesome. Yeah, that's it. Do most iconographers just do what you said and take the color palette and apply it in multiple places?
I think they do all kinds of stuff. Depends on the one. Probably, I don't know anyone else who does quite what I do as far as having a palette. I have my colors laid out on a palette when I'm finishing, like, and I mix on the palette like an oil painter would. So I don't know anyone else who does that, but people do. But there's as many different ways of doing things as there are iconographers.
How pleased are you so far with the way that everything is turning out? What's exciting, or what do you?
At St. John of the Ladder, I'm real pleased actually. I do take a lot of enjoyment of watching how it unfolds. I'm working on the east sides of the two transepts now, so you would see them to your right and left if you're facing towards the altar in church, and I'm getting to watch how some of those movements that are in the dome are getting to sort of like play out into the sort of like horizontal dimension in the church. And there's kind of a mountainous landscape that's gradually opening up as I do more parts, which I think I think it's working. A lot of the things that show up feel like gifts, as they come. I'm very conscious that it's really the community praying and living their life with God that's finding ways to show up. A lot of times, maybe most of the time, it surprises me too. This or that face, I feel like I'm kind of watching with the congregation, what's gonna show up now, and I'm happy with how it's going. I think it's going to be a real unique church when it's all done.
Will you stay in Greenville when it's done, or will you
Well, I don't
move
know.
somewhere else for another
I don't have to
10,
think about
15
it.
years?
I don't have to think about it for another 6 years or so, and it's a hard question. I might find a way to paint churches while, to paint churches in short bursts of travel. And there's things I do and don't like about that idea. And there's things I do and don't like about the idea of moving.
I mean, I guess you could kind of switch gears and do more, personal icons and iconostasis stuff. You don't seem too keen on that.
It's hard to make a living doing that, but maybe not impossible. I don't know.
I would imagine that it's a little difficult even doing what you're doing to make a living. But, how many full-time iconographers are there in the United States? I know Grigorenko and you. Are there like 100 others? 5 others?
Well, I guess it depends what you mean by full-time. But yeah, ones who paint churches who just live in the States year-round, I really don't know, but I'd put it around, I wouldn't be surprised if it was 10 or 20.
Not very many.
Yeah. But I could be a number that surprised me too, but those are the ones that wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, it's not like it's not a great way to get rich. I think as the church is growing, there'll be work for the few people who kind of like do whatever it takes to get qualified.
Well, I appreciate you coming on and talking to me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.